Welcome to Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. On this podcast, we journey through the devastating experience of the death of a child. Grief is seldom discussed openly in our culture, and the death of a child makes people feel even more uncomfortable. We approach the topic openly and honestly, speaking to people who have lost loved ones and experts who help care for them. Whether you are a parent experiencing loss or someone who wants to support another going through this tragedy, this podcast strives to offer hope and help.
Welcome to episode number 269 of Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. I'm Marcy Larson, Andy's mom. Today I have the absolute privilege to introduce you to David Kessler. David Kessler is David's dad, and I'm using his last name because if any of you really know the grief world, David Kessler is a very famous name in the grief community. I mean, some would say that he is one of the greatest grief experts that is living in this country today. When his publisher reached out to me to tell me that he wanted to be on the podcast in order to talk about his newest workbook that he had just published, I really felt privileged to be able to talk to him. I have known so many people who have read his books and attended his workshops and are in his online grief support community, Tender Hearts. I just knew that he would bless all of my listeners in such a rich way. Indeed, I can tell you already that he does not disappoint at all. You will be really blown away by his insight, and I know you will get so much out of it. I do also really want to say that the workbook is amazing. I got a copy right away and was able to go through it myself, and I would highly recommend it to anyone. So we'll talk about that towards the end, how you can go about getting an official copy, but I strongly, strongly recommend it. I also want to talk for a minute about next week's live stream. So next week we are having a live stream that will be on the Always Andy's Mom Facebook page, also on the Grief Guide Facebook page, or on the Always Andy's Mom Instagram page. And this is going to take place on Monday, November 11th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You may notice that this is Veterans Day, so we did take the opportunity to talk a little bit about sacrifice. So this week is going to be about sacrifice, and obviously we think a lot about sacrifice with Veterans Day, but we do a lot of sacrifice when we are grieving as well. So Gwen is going to give us some questions that we can think about ahead of time and just go on the Always Andy's Mom Instagram story or follow me on Facebook, and you can see some of those questions ahead of time and hopefully give some of those answers so we can have some topics to talk about in the live stream itself. Also, you know, I've been talking a lot about the Luella's Lodge retreats, and those retreats are opening back up again for next year. So Carrie from Luella's Lodge is also going to be a guest for a short period of time on that live stream. But right now, I just want you to sit back and enjoy listening to David's dad. Thank you so much, David, for agreeing to come on the Always Andy's Mom podcast today.
Oh, so glad to be with you. I wish we were doing the podcast that didn't have a David and Andy in it that
I know
ended in a tragedy. I wish we were like meeting and chatting about anything else, like how amazing our kids are doing in the world sort of podcast. But we have to live in reality, don't we?
That's right. This is the world we live in. So this is what we do, right? You make the best of that, and actually kind of that's a good segue into, I think, what brings us here, because I think we're both hoping to be able to bring a little hope and healing to people as they're going through their deepest, darkest tragedies.
Sure, of course.
Yeah, some of my friends, I was telling you that I was going to interview today, and they were like so excited. They said they were fangirling. They were thrilled that I was going to get to talk to you today. So anyway, they'll be excited. I want to start out, though, by just having you talk about your personal grief journey, because it started really many, many years ago now.
I had a challenging childhood.
Mm-hmm.
It was dysfunctional. There was abuse. There was neglect. And I learned loss occurs in many different ways. And then my mother, who was ill most of my life, when I was 13, she had to go to the hospital in the big city, which was hours away. You'll appreciate this as a pediatrician. She had to go to a hospital hours away for a new procedure called dialysis. And only like 6 hospitals had this procedure then. And they would vote on if you could qualify for it. Because like not everyone, it was almost like, imagine like today, it's like, do we give you a new heart? Do we do a heart transplant? Because, you had to be young enough and survivable enough because they didn't want to waste this dialysis procedure on just anyone. Mm-hmm. And those were the early ethicists that would sort of like do that voting. And they gave her one dialysis treatment, which we know now, well, that's not going to do a lot.
Oh, no.
And so here we were at this hospital hours away in the big city. And at the hotel where we were across the street, all of a sudden, they started yelling fire. Everyone ran out and looked up on the 18th floor, and there's fire coming out of the hotel room. And I watched the fire trucks pull up. Now, mind you, I am a bored child at that point, who's been in hotel and hospital lobbies because you had to be 14 to visit mom. And I was 13, so only a few nurses would let me go in. One nurse even told me, like, come back when you're 14. Like, oh, okay, that's a good plan.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Then the fire trucks pull up. It's somewhat exciting. And then all of a sudden, shooting begins. And
oh, my word.
It turns out this was one of the first mass shootings in the U.S. It went on for hours. Police officers, hotel guests, many people were killed. My father's desperately trying to get us back to the hotel, back to the hospital for safety. Finally, we get to the hospital. A couple of days later, my mother dies. We're not with her. The only advice I got was a stranger in the hallway who told me to be strong.
Yeah.
Which I think interprets as don't have feelings and take care of everyone else. At least that was my interpretation. And I came away from this broken, damaged, traumatized, in grief. And it's not like today where there's child life specialists and there's tons of social workers that were at the hospital. I mean, there was just not a lot of help back then. Mm-hmm. So that's what got me on this path. And one of the things I just thought, like, I'm broken and that's it. And this life is just the broken me. And then I got to community college and they told me there's 2 easy classes: human sexuality and death and dying. And like, while I'm waiting in line, they say, oh, the human sexuality class is full. Everyone else has to take death and dying if you want it. And everyone was bummed. But me, who was like secretly excited, like, really? There's a death and dying class? I know about this. And I got into class and there was a language for this pain I was in. Mm-hmm. I was shocked. There was a language. And there was this woman, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was this physician who talked about the dying patients. And she talked about these 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And
5 stages of dying, she called it,
5 stages of dying at the time.
Not 5 stages of grief. Yes, I have to clarify that a lot.
Right. Now, but if you read on death and dying, it does say they do apply to grief. In the original book, it does say that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
and it does also say in the original book, they're not in an order. They're not steps. I think Life magazine and the media and all that trying to turn it into 5 easy steps for dying.
I know. I was telling you that I speak to physician groups all the time. And one of the first things I do is say, everybody tell me the 5 steps, 5 stages of grief. And they all tell me. And then I say, don't pay any attention to it because it's not that simple. It's not linear. It doesn't look like that. You can feel all 5 on the same day. So
in the same hour.
Exactly. In the same minute almost. Minute. Right.
But little did I know I would go on to know her, work with her, and do 2 books with her. So following up on where you are, she became an amazing teacher of mine later in life. I worked in end-of-life care. I wrote my first book on hospice and palliative care, the needs of the dying. And I helped start one of the first hospital palliative care teams here in Los Angeles and was with the Hospital Association and sort of helped bring about palliative care to Southern California and it obviously started back east and helped bring about those changes because I even knew at that young age there was a better way to die than the way my mother died.
Right.
And, in the 70s, the family in the ICU was like an interruption of the care.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, the family was an interruption of the healing process. So I write this book. I get to know Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I'm so amazingly lucky. I get to go to, Calcutta and visit Mother Teresa's home for the dying, destitute, and get to know her. And these 2 women were just, I always say both of them put me on the map. I wouldn't, so many people write amazing books on dying and amazing books on grief and loss, and they don't get the awareness that they deserved. And these 2 women really helped put me on the map, and I'm forever grateful. Kubler-Ross and I would have this ongoing conversation, and it was very hard for her to imagine you've written 26 books, you've changed medicine, you've fought with Congress, you helped get hospice paid for by Medicare, you've done thousands of lectures, and people want to reduce your work to 5 words. It drove her crazy.
Oh, my word, I bet.
To think about it from that context, that people forget, she helped get a hospice pay. All the things she did. And so I would often talk to her about, those stages are getting so misinterpreted. Yeah. And, she would go, look, if you read the original book, da-da-da. And I go, yeah, but, they're getting misinterpreted.
Because people don't read the original book. They get the little tidbits. Mm-hmm.
So, they get the news clipping of the 5 easy steps.
Right.
And after, I thought we were, that sort of discussion had been done, I think she had seen something and it really shifted her. And she called me and she said, all right, I want to formally adapt the stages of dying for stages of grief. Let's do a book, which we did on grief and grieving. And literally on page 1, we say, there's no such a thing as one grief model. There's no such thing as one way to do grief. There's no 5 easy steps. Grief is messy.
Yes.
And it's fascinating, decades later, when I hear people criticize, they go, you don't understand, and they criticize the stages. I'm like, did you read page 1 of the book? Page 1, we agree with you. Mm-hmm. Page 1, we agree.
Well, and I have to say, when I give that talk, I always say, this is not what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross meant. This is not well interpreted.
Or even wrote.
Right. Or even wrote, or any of it. It's just what you all have picked up through your intro to psychology class that you learned in college. You all got this nice, simple thing. And of course, the problem is so many now grieving people think they're doing it wrong because they're not going through this. Right. Or if I've gone through anger, I'm done with anger. And I don't know. Many times I thought, okay, I'm finally let go of the anger. And then, it would sneak back because they do. They come, they go, and there's no rhyme or reason sometimes to why they come back.
So continuing on in this line here, I, after that, spent decades working in grief and loss and did the 2 books with Elizabeth, a couple of books on my own. And after all of that, I believed my grief was behind me. Mm-hmm. And my younger son, David, died unexpectedly at 21 years old. And I was thrown back into the epicenter.
Right.
So, one of the first things, I was on the floor and, didn't get up.
Yeah.
And then at a certain point, one of the feelings I had is the pain was so intense. I wanted, and I said this, I wanted to write every bereaved parent I had ever counseled a note saying, I'm sorry, I did not understand how bad the pain was.
Yeah.
And as I went through that process, I was someone who in my work handed out, go to a grief counselor, go to a grief group. I handed that out like candy. Like, go to a grief counselor, go to a grief group. Let me tell you, I knew I had to take my own medicine. I knew I had to go to a grief counselor, and I knew I had to go to a grief group. It took me, a grief specialist, 3 times to just walk in the door finally of the grief group. Like there were 2 failed attempts. Like I couldn't get all the way in. And when I got in, I had my baseball cap on and I sat in a grief group 5 feet from a table with all my books on it. And I couldn't say, that's me. I'm that grief person. I had to be the father that buried a child.
It's funny. I just to interrupt you for a second, I've got a mom that is in a group with me now. She's from Melbourne, and she keeps telling me, I'm going to go to the Compassionate Friends group in Melbourne. I'm going to go. And the most she's done is gotten her shoes on, I think, and walked to the car. And that's all she's done. And I said, you know what? Let's celebrate that. Let's celebrate the fact that you put your shoes on and you got in the car. Next time, maybe you'll make it there. Who knows? Maybe you'll make it to the parking lot. Maybe you'll make it in. It's hard. It's hard to take those steps and walk in.
And I'll tell you, that changed me because now in my work, whether someone comes to my online groups or comes to anything, just the other day I had an event, and I don't do a lot of in-person events, but we had one in Atlanta. 600 people showed. And I got to tell you, when people show up for their own grief now, I applaud them. It is a big deal that you showed up for you. And you're right. It might take 7 attempts before you make it. It was 3 for me, and I've spent my life in this work.
Right.
So I also had, as I went through my own pain, I was curious, is what I've been doing all these years correct, helpful? Will I be making adjustments? There was that part of my brain that went, oh, boy, you're in denial. You can't believe he's gone. Oh, you're angry. Yep, you're there. You're bargaining. You're doing the what ifs, the if onlys, the guilt. Oh, you're in sadness, you're in depression. And I'm, narrowing down. This was a process of, a long time. This wasn't, but as we said earlier, it can happen in an hour or 2. And, the stages, of course, weren't in that order as I saw them. And there's a million other feelings in between. But when I began to think about, I'm going to have to try to accept this someday.
Yeah.
and Kubler-Ross and I also were so challenged that people not only thought the stages were neat and 5 easy steps, but they thought there was one big acceptance and you find it and you're done. And there's a million little acceptances.
Right.
A million acceptances. And so when I began to go, I've got to accept this someday, I was like, there has to be more. There has to be more. And so one day out of the blue, I was sitting at my desk and I was going through some papers. It's sort of like you're not working. There's time to go through the piles of papers I never really went through.
Right.
Here was this paper I had written on meaning in Viktor Frankl's work. And I remember looking at it, picking it up, going, like, that's going to help. And maybe a few weeks later, I picked it up again and began reading it. And it actually did sort of cushion the pain a bit. And I thought, is there meaning to be found? And I just got curious about, is there meaning to be found? So it became a focus of mine in my own healing. And by the way, I just want to let everyone know, when I use the word healing, I do not mean, because there's lots of different definitions, I don't mean forgetting. I don't mean getting over. I mean the event no longer controls us. That's what my healing looks like today. David's death doesn't control how I remember him. I get to remember his life more than his death. I get to remember the love more than the pain. And I get to not make decisions from that moment. And that takes a long time.
You know, I always think too, with healing, I think it's because I'm a physician. I think healing is so much different from curing too,
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
When you've cured it, that means it's gone away. When you've healed, you know, there's oftentimes a very big scar that's left over. And sometimes that scar hurts and that's still painful. So I always think of that too, and like to emphasize that healing leaves some scars behind.
Right.
But it's no longer an open wound that is always festering for every waking moment. Mm-hmm.
I actually want those wounds to remain.
Mm-hmm.
I actually am okay with that scar. I want that to be, you know?
Right. Yeah.
And so as I think about that, I also think about going through that process. And I often talk about, you know, when I talk about healing, I never talk about ED. There's no healed. Yeah. There's no, oh, I'm healed. I am forever healing. And like you say, you know, the scar will be there. I believe that's true, and I want that scar. So I began to think about, and by the way, at that point, I had lived through 20 years of the misunderstanding of the stages. And people aren't going back and reading the old books. I wish they were. So as I began to talk about meaning, I thought, oh, could this be not only my healing, but something I want to learn more about? And I dove in and I realized one of the confusing things about meaning is not in the horrific event. People go, meaning? There's no meaning in the death of a child. There's no meaning in a murder. There's no meaning in these horrible things. And I'll go, correct. The meaning isn't in the horrible event. It's in us. It's what we do later. So interestingly enough, my publisher, Simon & Schuster at the time, is also Kubler-Ross's publisher. So of course they go, this is the 6th stage. And I was like, no, not the stages again. And
but everyone knows the stages, so okay.
Kubler-Ross's family will never go for that. And they were like, well, what if we asked? And I was so honored that they literally said it's okay for me to talk about a 6th stage. And I went, when I heard that was possible, I went, it is a chance to go back and clarify the stage work a bit. But I do tell people I'm not adding a mandatory step to the mandatory stages you think you have to do in your mind.
Right.
But, and I talk about meaning like everything else is optional, but it did help so much. And so that became Finding Meaning, the book. It's also something in the last few years that's happened is people would go, you got to do your grief work. And that became a phrase like, do your grief work. And people go, what's my grief work? And I would often go, well, I think your grief work is just anytime you attend your grief. I think that's sort of what your grief work is. But as you know, you've had friends that have gone through it. I have a grief educator program and I train therapists now and coaches and people who turn their pain into purpose. And I went, I want to take the things that I train therapists in and put them in a workbook.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to be like we're sitting at your kitchen table and we're talking these things through. And I make a joke about I've had so many wonderful co-authors. So this new workbook has a co-author too. It's the person who's doing it with me at that moment. It's the person sitting at their kitchen table doing it. So that's, the newest thing that I finally did is a workbook around grief, because people, I realize, need strategies. Not everyone can afford therapy. I'm a big believer in therapy. I'm a big believer in groups. Not everyone has a group close by. I have groups for people who have had a child die in other groups, and no one's ever turned away from lack of funds. I always remind people of that, but it is, sometimes you just want to do your grief work alone at the kitchen table.
Yep. And I have people that start doing their grief work just by listening to my podcast.
Absolutely. That is grief work.
Right. And that is grief work. That is intentional time that you set aside. It's funny. I had a woman in New York that talked to me about how she would put in her AirPods and be listening to me, and she would talk back to me. She's talking to me the whole time. And she said, and everyone in Manhattan thinks that I'm talking to someone on the phone, and I'm not, but I'm talking back to you. And she was doing her grief work. Right. But it felt a little bit easier, a little bit safer to do it in that environment. And, eventually maybe you go to a virtual group, or you go to a group that you have in person in your local community. I mean, there are many, many options, but it can be hard to make that first step.
Absolutely. And just like we said, whatever step you make is the step.
Right. I think when Andy died, it was our funeral director gave me a pamphlet, flipped it to the back, circled a number, and said, call this woman. And I did not know what was going on, right? I felt completely lost, destroyed. I had no idea what to do. But all I kept thinking was, well, that guy told me to call this number, so I guess I'm going to call this number. And I found myself in a grief support group 3 weeks after Andy died. And it was such a blessing to me, but I know that not everyone has that in their community. So that's why I do what I do now. But it's hard. It's hard. And it's messy.
Very messy. Very messy. Grief is messy. Once in a while, someone will make a comment. You and Kubler-Ross are just trying to neaten up our grief. And I'm like, first of all, Kubler-Ross was a messy person. I'm a messy person. Neat is not a word anyone would describe either Kubler-Ross or me as. But I think, sometimes, and, there's just one of the things I think we all learn is there's just no one right way to do grief.
Mm-mm.
There's no, like the grief of Andy is different than the grief of David. Even though we're both bereaved parents, our grief is so different. We have different histories. We're two different people. We have different children.
Mm-hmm. And even my husband and I have different grief, right?
Absolutely.
We're grieving the same person, and our grief is not the same. I mean, we can certainly help and support each other through it, but it doesn't mean it's exactly the same, even though we're missing the same kid with the same relationship.
And it's interesting, in the Tender Hearts group, we talk a lot about couples who go through this. And, the myth that, the death of a child causes divorce. I always say, death of a child doesn't cause divorce. Judgment of each other's grief does. Mm-hmm. And so I really help parents attend their own grief very differently, and to understand that two devastated, empty people can't be each other's grief counselors.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You feel like you should sometimes, but
you feel like you should. You share this love for this child, and you feel like you should. And if someone's not, or whatever goes on, the stories we have, we feel like, well, does that mean you didn't love them? What, all those thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's like even comments that some people say, people saying, oh, you're so strong. I wouldn't be able to get out of bed. I wouldn't be able to. Those are so not helpful, those kind of comments. When you say you're so strong, now it's like, you're so strong, you don't need me. Or you're so strong, I wouldn't be able to do that. And then it's like, so what? You love your kid more than I loved mine? I don't know what that means. You don't know. That's certainly not what they meant, but what it can feel like sometimes.
Where the problem is, think about it from even your point as a physician. We're not seeing them. We're not assessing them. We're not taking who they are. We're not asking about them. We're putting a label on, you're strong. That's it. We're just throwing the label on them. We're missing their pain. We're missing their heartbreak. We're missing who they are in that moment, because we decided, I'm going to label you as strong because, and by the way, when they're going, you're so strong, I couldn't do it. Sometimes I got to tell you, my thing that people would say to me that would get me, I think we all have different things that get us, would be, oh, David, I can't imagine. Can't imagine one of my kids dying. And I would go, first of all, you don't have to use your imagination. I'm right here. If you got any questions, I can tell you what it's like. And two, when you're imagining your live kids dying, you have left me. You're not giving me any support. You're in your own imagination of your own nightmare, and you've left me.
Oh, I love that. That's put beautifully. It's really
there's no support there. I'm watching you imagine your healthy live kids dying. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also want to say, and I think this is important, no one gets up in the morning and goes, all right, I'm going to go be mean to a bereaved parent. I mean, no one gets up with that intention. It's a grief illiterate world. No one means to do that.
Right. And so having grace is important for sure, but it can be hard to have
patience. It can be hard. It can be hard.
So I want to talk about your workbook a little bit, because there were some things that I really, really loved about it. And the one thing I want to talk about first was your chapter that you did on guilt. Because I have certainly found, I don't think I've talked to one bereaved parent over these last 5+ years that has not felt a measure of guilt, right? Correct. Because you feel like from the moment, if you're a woman, you're pregnant, or your spouse or partner is pregnant, you feel like it is your job to protect and raise your child. And so when they die, no matter what the cause, even though there is no way you could have done anything, you have this sense of, this was my job to make sure they grew up, and they didn't. So you have this guilt, and it goes in many, many areas. And I think about that because when my mom died, I certainly had little bits of guilt, like, was I a good enough daughter? Did I visit enough when I was in college? Some of those things. But I didn't feel guilt over her death. But it seems that most parents do feel that guilt. And I'm so glad that you put it in. And what I usually say is it's easier to feel guilt than to feel powerless. So when you realized you had no power over the situation, when your child was going to die and you couldn't control it, it is easier to feel guilt than to acknowledge the fact that you were powerless. Right. And in your workbook, you said helpless. You used a little different word than I used, but it's the same concept.
Right, because the mind study have said in our brain that our brain wants to find a false sense of control. Mm-hmm. And so we would always rather feel guilty and believe it was this that did it than to live in a world where our other children could die or we can cause our children death.
I was telling my partners this just yesterday. I was saying, just so you know, they're all going to feel this way. So telling them they shouldn't feel guilty is not helpful. Because that now you feel guilty over the fact that you feel guilty and you still feel guilty. So it doesn't help. But what I love in your workbook is you actually did go through some exercises to be able to help go through that. So I'd love for you to touch on those a little bit. I mean, you don't have to give everything in the workbook away, but I loved that because there were some more tangible things to try to confront that.
And here's the thing about this. I will talk about them. It is hard to just hear them intellectually without doing them. I mean, when I walk people through this like this, they're like, what's that going to do? And I go, well, it's not going to do anything if you don't sit down and actually do these. Just to hear about them, you're going to go, I don't know what that is. So I'm happy to walk you through them. But I also want to say, one of the early things in the workbook is I try to help people identify, do they have shame in their grief? And you don't understand how the guilt produces shame. And what's surprising is just like you, I feel like, well, as a parent, I used to say, when my kids, you'll appreciate this as a pediatrician, success is going to be if I get my kids into adulthood with 10 fingers and 10 toes. If nothing got cut off, I parented well. I never, at a bare minimum, I needed to keep them alive.
Right. I know. And people did that all the time in the pandemic, right? There were all these funny memes because I'm stuck at home with my kids all the time, 24/7. Well, at least they're still alive. And every time I'd read one of those comments, I would think to myself, and I couldn't even do that. Right? That's where that guilt would come on me because I was, just over a year after losing Andy when all of that. And that's always what it came back to dig at me as. Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you, one of the things that's surprising is just to be aware of that shame. And I didn't think I had a lot of the shame. And all of a sudden, maybe a year later, or 2 years later, a friend called me up who has 2 children, and she called me up asking me for parent advice. And I stopped in my tracks and I said, you're asking me for parent advice? And she goes, yeah. I mean, what did you do when your kids da-da-da? Because she has 2 boys, I had 2 boys. She goes, what did your kids do when they were da-da-da? And I go, and it just brought tears to my eyes. And she goes, what? And I said, I just feel like you're asking someone for parenting advice whose child died. I don't feel like I'm worthy anymore of getting asked. Mm-hmm. And it just broke my heart. So that's why I wanted to even put in the shame part. And by the way, if people just want to, I put hard things in the workbook to look at, open-ended questions, and easy things. If anyone wants to just get a glimpse of this, they can go and look at the shame one. They just go to shameworksheet.com and they can just take a look at that shame worksheet. It's an easy one. But when I talk about the guilt, here's what I try to walk people through. There is a number of things I help them. That the first thing I talk to them about is confabulation. Confabulation is we believe the stories we tell ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's, everything about the brain, what we repeat over and over, the neurons that, fire together, wire together. When we tell that story, it's our fault. That becomes a story we believe, whether it's true or not. That's the first piece to understand. The second piece I walk people through in the workbook is proximal causation. Proximal causation means what happened before the death did not cause the death. We often think, oh my gosh, I didn't return their phone call. That's why they died by suicide. Oh my gosh, I told them I couldn't bring them to the 12-step meeting. That's why they died by addiction. Oh my gosh, I asked the nurse to give the pain medication on palliative care or hospice. That's why my child died of cancer, And we think that event that happened was the cause, and we zone in on that and then beat ourselves up about it. We find something we did because we want to live in a world where, see, we did this. And if we don't do this again, we're going to be safe. Don't ask the nurse for pain medications and we're safe, right? The next thing I walk people through is scientific theory we all learned in 5th grade about you take a hypothesis and you test it. Is it true asking a nurse for pain medication causes death? Is it true? And there's really subtle things like this. Is it true that if you die with an illness, it means you missed something? You did something wrong. There was I find so many times people believe that the cure was somewhere to be found and they just didn't look hard enough.
Yep.
So
one more second opinion. One more
second opinion. Mm-hmm. I have them, and there's things you can appreciate. We believe them. And what I love about doing the online groups now in Tender Hearts is that if I told you, wait, you think your child died because you brought them to the emergency room and you didn't tell the doctors to check their heart? You think that was the cause. Like if I told you, oh my gosh, let me explain how the emergency room works. First thing they check is the heart. Like out of the gate, no matter the circumstances, they're checking to see if there's a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. And that person can't hear that about themselves. But what I love about group work is you can see someone else say that story and you can go, oh, that's confabulation. Oh, no, that doesn't make sense. Of course they checked for a heartbeat. So we need to test those theories. And then when we look at, if only I hadn't asked for that pain medication in a hospice or in palliative care when my child was dying of cancer. Once we begin to see, no, people ask for pain medication all the time. You don't die from that. Mm-hmm. Then we go to the last one, which is Occam's razor. And Occam's razor says, the simplest explanation is often the truest. Wait a minute. Let me just check in. We've established that people ask for pain medication all the time, all over the world, and they don't die because of that. You said your child was in hospice, palliative care. Why? Oh, they had advanced, aggressive, stage 4 cancer? Occam's razor goes, that's the elephant in the room. They did not die of you. They did not die of you failing them. They died of the cancer. Now, it sounds when you hear these too simplistic. That's why I really like people to sort of sit down and work through these in the workbook and write their explanations and stories down to examine them themselves.
Yeah, and I did that, and so many of my listeners know my story. So we were rear-ended on driving on our way to a baseball game, but what did I do to myself? Why did I let him go upstairs and change his clothes after soccer practice? We should have gotten right in the car. Why did I stop to pick up that ticket when someone volunteered to bring it to me? Why? All of these things. And as I went through that exercise, all of those thoughts are coming through. I have a million what ifs on what I could have done differently. But when it comes to the end, I could not control the woman who was not paying attention and speeding in a construction zone and rear-ended us and killed him. That's, ultimately it's that. And it was a really good exercise for me to go through to see all of the ways that I have thought about how if I just did something differently. And I've thought this many times, and I've known too that, if we wouldn't have been in that spot in traffic, somebody else would have been, and somebody else would have been killed. But it was a really good exercise, I feel like, to go through. So that's why I wanted you to do that. But I also wanted to give my personal kind of what that meant for me.
It's heartbreaking to hear that. And no wonder your mind, which our minds are projective and predictive, and it wants to find some control for the future.
Yes.
It wants to believe you did it. And what a heartbreaking story about Andy. I just, heartbreaking to hear. And you just did something I do. I said it was heartbreaking. You gave a little shrug of our shoulders. Yeah, that's what and it's like, it's heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
And our stories, all our stories are heartbreaking. And they're the hardest things in the world to live through.
Right.
They're so hard to live through. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I also put in this workbook is a disloyalty checklist. How many of us have beliefs that living again would be disloyal?
For sure.
I had a thing when I started lecturing again. The organization started sending the pamphlets back out with rescheduled dates. And I got emails from people that said, I got the brochure that David's doing his lecture again, and it's rescheduled. And he's smiling in that picture. And I happen to know he's a bereaved parent now, and he should not be smiling. And we had to really sit and go, okay, I hear their opinion. I need to go inside and see what feels right for me. Now, by the way, it was an old picture, so it had nothing to do with anything. But I had to really go, that's a fascinating question. Do I get to smile again? And I had to really go inside and look at, oh, David loved my smile. I want to smile in his honor. I want to live a life that he would be proud of. Took me a long time to get there. I don't think you can throw those things on parent in day one. So many people do that, oh, Andy would want you to be happy.
Oh my gosh.
Don't you tell me what my son would want.
Exactly. And it's funny because I can say that to myself and that's fine. And even another bereaved parent can softly say that to me and it will be okay. But if anyone else says it to me, I'm going to shoot daggers at you, right? That is not okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I do feel like, too, even I've done this podcast for a long time, and we just did one a couple weeks ago. Our last live stream was on finding purpose and finding little bits of purpose, like reasons to get up in the morning. And we had done one a couple of years ago on meaning making. And Gwen, my thanatologist that's on with me every 6 weeks or so, even said to me how different she thought I was this time than the first time, because it takes some time for you to kind of accept the fact that it's okay to have meaning, and it's okay that good things come from something awful. And I always think that, this podcast and me being able to talk to bereaved parents came about in spite of the fact that I was in so much pain. I don't like to think of it like Andy had to die for me to help other people. But in spite of the fact that Andy died and I've gone through this pain, I've been able to do this work. You've been able to do this work.
And that's one of the things I talk about early on in the workbook around it. By the way, anyone who's interested in the workbook, you can go right to the workbook. You don't have to go back and read the original book. You can start with the workbook. It's designed by that. And, that idea of, first of all, people hear, finding meaning and all that. The workbook is about excavating the pain. And I don't tell anyone their meaning. When you excavate the pain, meanings get revealed. Andy didn't die and you didn't go day one podcast. That's it. You work through the pain. little by little, moment by moment. And then people go, meaning, oh my God, do I have to do a podcast? Do I have to do a charity? No, meaning is in the moments. And sometimes just to name them, like one parent, we spent 2 hours together and she told me about her son who died at 2 years old. And she told me after it was all done, she goes, do you understand why there can be no meaning? I said to her, I completely understand why you feel there can be no meaning. And I just want you to know, these 2 hours hearing about your son are so meaningful. And I have glimpses of him. And he lives now even in my mind and in my heart. And that's so meaningful. Like right now, you and I talking on this podcast is so meaningful. Because I know someone's going to hear this and just to name this meaningful moment. And that's, the idea, I wish I could sit down with every parent and do this workbook, but I couldn't. And that's why I wanted it to work without me. And, we have free classes to help people start the workbook. Because just like you said, it's scary. Someone said, I bought the workbook, it got delivered, but I'm not ready to open it. And I go, that's fine. And I said, I'm just curious, what's the fear of opening it? And she goes, I'm not ready to go into the pain. And I said, oh my gosh, I completely understand that. And I tell you a reality? And she goes, yes. And I said, I wish you could take the workbook and put it on a shelf far away and keep your pain at distance. But the pain is actually not in the workbook. And avoiding the workbook isn't avoiding the pain. The pain is in you. The workbook is a way to get the pain out of you and get it on paper, for you to witness it, for you to release it. And as we talked, one of the weird things about our new world is there's AI workbooks. And they've already come up with an AI workbook. So I always say to folks, if you're looking for the Finding Meaning workbook, make sure it's the one authored by me, or go to grief.com and see a link, or go to griefbook.com to see all the links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble and your independent bookstore so that you get the right book if you choose to get it.
Right. Yes, you were saying that now that this AI, there can be stuff that's not even, you didn't even say. It's not even at all true. So that's a good lesson and reminder to all of us too.
In our new world. Well,
absolutely.
So glad to have had this time with you and me tomorrow.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and your just wisdom with us. I really appreciated this last almost hour and so wish you luck, and really, really, truly would love all of my listeners to get this workbook, because I really do think it would be beneficial to everyone.
Yeah, thank you so, so much. And I so appreciate you doing this. And I hope, I always hope this for people, that you can see the meaning you're making in the lives you are touching, and just know you are. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you found this helpful and would like to support the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and comment. To help financially, you can type Andy's Mom, one word, to the number 53555. This provides a link to GiveButter, which allows donations through PayPal, Venmo, Apple Pay, or credit cards. GiveButter will provide a receipt of your tax-deductible donation. Or you can visit the donation page at andysmom.com/donate. Always Andy's Mom is a registered 501c3 and can receive donations through Thrivent Financial and Benevity. Marcy loves hearing from listeners. Please feel free to reach out to her via email at marcy@andysmom.com or on the Instagram or Facebook Always Andy's Mom accounts. Sign up for the email list to get weekly episode links as well as pictures of Marcy's guests and their children. Together, let's work to inspire hope, one day at a time.